in summary, libertarian free will claims that your free choices cannot be determined, and yet claims that you determine them. But if your choices are determined by yourself, then they cannot be free according to the libertarian definition of freedom, because free choices cannot be determined. If this is not a self-contradictory proposition, I'm not sure of anything else that can be. Welcome to Press On Towards the Goal. This video will be an attempt to condense down and to explain the fundamental flaw of libertarian free will. Now, if you happen to hold a libertarian free will, consider this my personal plea to you. As always, I proudly reserve the right to be an idiot, but promise me that you will at least genuinely consider what is said here. Now, I have other slower paced videos that can go into greater detail about many of the points I'm going to bring up here. So if you're unfamiliar with any of the terms or the concepts I'm talking about, please check those out first. So in conversations about free will, usually those who hold a libertarian free will, which is simply the position that our free choices are not determined, present libertarian free will as if it were the safe option. This is opposed to question begging or demanding that there be a deterministic explanation for how choices are made. But I would like to suggest to you that libertarian free will is not the safe option. And to give you the best possible chance of seeing what I mean by this, I'm going to give you an analog, an example to think about first. So the analog I have chosen to use is the philosophy of moral relativism. In Christian apologetics, this is one of the first philosophies we learn to refute because its falsehood is seen easily. The relativist claims that there is no objective, absolute truth, and therefore every person is free to determine right and wrong for themselves. Relativists often champion this belief as the safe option when it comes to morality. They believe that Christians are the presumptuous and dogmatic ones, since they tirelessly insist that truth and morality must have an objective explanation. Relativists pride themselves in their restraint for not assuming that there must be an explanation for true morality, and they will not budge from this position until they realize that their entire belief system self-destructs. If you're new to this idea, consider what they're saying for a moment. Their claim is that there is no absolute truth. Yet, at the same time, they are claiming that that statement is an absolute truth. So we respond to them, if there is no absolute truth, then how can that be absolutely true? The claim of relativism is fundamentally flawed. It is inherently a self-contradiction. It is not a safe option by any means, it's the foolish one. The only other option is that there is absolute truth. And this is the only option that is available that doesn't immediately self-destruct or contradict itself. Now I ask you, are Christians question begging? Are they just presumptuously assuming that there must be an objective explanation for truth? Are they just being dogmatic about truth in this case so they can make God fit into the worldview? How would you answer? It should be pretty clear that there's only one explanation that makes any logical sense. To say that there is no truth is obviously a truth claim, but a truth cannot exist if there is no truth. The Christian alternative is not presumptuous. It is simply the only option for anyone who wishes to be rational. Now, I hope I haven't bored you with this analog, but it is absolutely crucial that we do not confuse logical consistency for dogmatism. Because once you do that, you might as well throw out the entire Christian faith and all those inconvenient explanations that it demands the world to accept. Because when it comes to truth, we know that there are only two options. There are consistent options and there are inconsistent options. So now, let's consider the case of libertarian free will. The basic claim of libertarian free will is that our free choices are not determined. That is to say that nothing causes our choices. You are the determiner of your own choices. This is why it's often called contra-causal free will. But you see here, we already have a problem. If a free choice is by definition not determined, then how can one claim that those free choices are determined by us? For if by this definition our free choices are not caused, is it not an obvious contradiction to then claim that those free choices are caused and caused by us? A choice is either determined or it is not. To claim that you can determine an undetermined choice is plainly inconsistent unless we decide to ignore the definition of words. But even more importantly, if we are the cause and the determiner of our choices, then those choices, by definition, cannot be free choices. Because according to the libertarian definition of free will, free choices cannot be determined or caused. Consider the similarities now to our analog of relativism and our response to it. The relativist says, there is no truth. But then we ask, is that true? The libertarian says, our choices are not caused. But then we ask, then how can you cause them? They say our choices are free because they are not determined. But then we ask, if you determine your choices, then how can they be free choices? And at this point, I believe anyone without a pre-existing bias or understanding of what free will is or is not would immediately see that the fundamental claim of libertarian free will self-destructs. That it's not even an option if you want to be rational. This is not a matter of dogmatism, this is just common sense. Now, please hear me carefully. I'm not saying that just because it's common sense, it's easy to wrap our heads around a difficult philosophical concept like this one. I know it can take a long time to wrap our heads around these things, and it certainly has for me. So let me solidify this with an illustration. Picture three things: a golfer, his golf club, and his swing. Our will is like the golf club. A choice is when our will moves into action, or in other words, when the golf club swings. Our choices determine and cause our actions just like the golf club causes and determines a golf ball to fly down the range as a result of its swing. Now again, the fundamental assumption of libertarian free will is that our will and our choices are not determined. They are self-determined. This would be the equivalent of saying that the golf club swings itself. Nothing determines how it shall swing, for its ability to move comes from within itself. If something restrained the golf club from swinging in one direction, then it would not be a free swing. If something determined that it would swing in a particular direction, then it would not be a free swing because its ability to self-determine its own actions would be compromised. Now, aside from the fact that it is contrary to reason to assume that a golf club can swing itself, can you see what the contradiction would be using this illustration? Remember, the libertarian claims that you determine your choices. But if the golf club's freedom is defined as its ability to swing itself without anything determining which way it shall go, how then can the golfer determine how to swing the golf club without violating the club's freedom to swing itself? Unless we throw away the definitions of words here, there are only two options. Either the golf club swings itself, or the golfer swings it. Either our choices are not determined, or we determine them. But to claim that we can determine an undetermined choice would make as little sense as saying that we can swing a golf club that actually swings itself, or claiming that we can determine how the golf club will swing, but at the same time that the golf club can swing itself in any direction that it wishes. If you determine your own choices, then they are, in fact, determined. They cannot be otherwise. But if your free choices are not determined, then you can't determine them. If you are the cause of your own choices, then your choices are, well, caused. If your choices must be uncaused in order to be free, then they cannot be free if you cause them. Now, some will still insist that I am in question begging here, that I am demanding a deterministic explanation for our choices. I would say that such an argument forgets its own assumptions, for libertarian free will claims that you are the deterministic causal explanation of your choices. The presumption we discussed earlier was that you are the golfer who swings the club. You are the cause of your own choices. That is the exact same thing as saying that your choices have a cause and an explanation. So both parties here are demanding a deterministic explanation. The question again comes back to which is actually consistent. Now still others will attempt to solve this contradiction by maybe offering that a person and their choices are the same thing, that the golfer and the golf club operate as one without any distinctions. But again, this reasoning forgets its own argument. The libertarian argument is that you are the cause and the explanation of your choices. Now, in order for something to be a cause, well, it must meet the basic definition of a cause. A cause must be distinct from its effect, prior to it, and the reason for why its effect is one way and not another. If you and your choices are the same thing, then you cannot be the cause of those choices by the very definition of a cause. For something cannot be the cause of itself before it exists. For nothing cannot do anything. The cause of a choice cannot be the same thing as that choice or happen at the same instant, for then it would not be a cause. More than this, we are not the same thing as our choices. We have been created and designed with moral agency, which is the ability to make choices that factor morality into their consideration. But we are not the same thing as our moral agency. When someone does something wrong, we never say, it was the choice's fault, or that it was the fault of my moral agency, because we know that the moral agent is not the same thing as their moral agency. Our identity comes from being made in the image of God. Moral agency is certainly part of that image, but it is not synonymous with it. And still others will insist that, well, I have not defined libertarian freedom correctly. They might say that they don't believe that our free choices cannot be determined, as I have said. They believe that our free choices just cannot be determined by anything other than themselves. And so they would adjust my definition to specify that a free choice is only free if you are the cause of it and nothing else determines that choice but yourself. But this definition, once again, forgets its own definition of freedom. For if your choices are in fact determined by yourself, as they say, then those choices cannot be otherwise. Is that not the definition of determination? A determined choice is a choice that cannot be otherwise. But libertarian freedom claims that you have the ability to choose otherwise in all of the free decisions that you make. But if something can be otherwise, it is by definition not determined. So unless we start changing the definitions of words, if a choice can actually be otherwise, then it is not determined. And if it is not determined, then you cannot somehow be the cause of that choice. But now for a final objection, which might be the most important objection of all. Please make sure that you are following me up to this point, because this will be the easiest place to lose you if you haven't wrapped your head around everything we've talked about so far. All right, this objection might sound something like this. But just because I determine my choices, that doesn't mean that I could not have determined them to be otherwise. It's true, I determine my choices, but I'm still free to determine whatever choice that I want. My choice of which choice to determine can be otherwise. So this is saying that once you make a choice, it is only then that the choice cannot be otherwise and is determined. But up until that point, it can be otherwise. This is saying that our free will consists in our ability to choose for ourselves what choice it is that we will actually end up determining. And this sounds pretty darn plausible on the surface. This is the same thing as saying that every free act is a two-stage event. You have the choice that you actually determine, but before that, you have a choice of which choice you will determine. And so every free act actually consists of two choices. Now suddenly that second choice, the thing that you actually end up determining, the choice we've been talking about all the way up to this point, is finally logically consistent. This objection finally admits that this choice, the second choice, is determined and cannot be otherwise. And so the problem, the contradiction, it seems to be solved. But all that it's really done is move the problem back one level. Because note that the first choice, this choice of which choice you are actually going to finally determine, is exactly what it claims to be. It's a choice. Meaning that all of the logical fallacies we've discussed still apply here. For if a choice can be otherwise, as you say, then it cannot be determined. And if it cannot be determined, then you can't be the cause of that choice. This is the same error as we talked about earlier, trying to claim that the golfer is the one who swings the golf club, but that the golf club actually swings itself. All we've done is move the issue back one choice in the process now. And this objection fails for the exact same reasons as all the others. Now, even if we grant that every free act is a two-stage process of two choices, the second one being determined and the first having the freedom to be otherwise, we still have a big problem. Since none of us have existed eternally, there must have been some first choice that we made that began the series of all the other choices that we have made up until this point. Think of it as a chain. And at the beginning of this chain of all of our choices, there must be a first link from which all the others are attached. There must be a first choice. And unless we change the definition of the word first, when something is first, that means that nothing comes before it. Meaning that the first determined choice we ever made had no choice which came before it. And so the very first choice that we ever determined cannot have been part of a free act. Because this objection, remember, rests on the claim that every free act consists of the choice we determine and a choice which came before it, the choice of which choice to determine. But in our first determined choice, this cannot possibly have been the case, because it did not have a choice that came before it, because it was the first one. And so if our first choice was not part of a free act, then in some sense it determined the rest of the choices that we made after that, which ultimately means that none of the choices we have ever made have been truly free, since our first choice did not meet the definition of a free act under this objection. So, in summary, libertarian free will claims that your free choices cannot be determined, and yet claims that you determine them. But if your choices are determined by yourself, then they cannot be free according to the libertarian definition of freedom, because free choices cannot be determined. If this is not a self-contradictory proposition, I'm not sure of anything else that can be. This would be opposed, of course, to the simple and logically consistent explanation of our choices, that our freedom rests in the fact that we can choose to do what we please according to our own dispositions, and that our dispositions, our desires, determine what we please, and are ultimately the cause of our choices as moral agents. More on this to follow.